Good morning once again. On behalf of Muwatin, executive team and the board, I welcome you, and I wish and even expect to have two rich days, rich in analysis and proposals that may open a window for salvation and would be a motive for restoring our national unity around a comprehensive program that reflects the supreme national interest, especially that the lessons of history teach us that national unity is one of the most important conditions for reaching independence of peoples and the right to self-determination. Allow me first to point out the conscious approach of Muwatin to represent its conviction in the role of women and youth in decision-making at the national level and in developing a national vision for the Palestinian situation. You might notice this approach adopted by Muwatin through the various sessions and papers that will be presented in this conference. I hope that all our organizations will enrich this conscious approach and to give the necessary forum to reflect and express the role of women and youth. This conference looks at the Arab and Palestinian landscape from the perspective of fragmentation and division vis-à-vis the revolution. One can only stop at this historic paradox that might be shocking and confusing at the same time. This historic paradox is manifested upon comparison of the status of the Palestinian national movement and the status of the Arab revolutions or uprisings of the Arab Spring. In the Arab landscape, we see from a certain perspective uprisings or revolutions of the Arab Spring that were manifested in the models of the Tahrir Square vis-à-vis a counter-revolution that tries to abort these revolutions through systemic action to fragment the national identity into identities that are based on considerations and affiliations that might be religious or ethnic or secular or even factional or regional, as is the case in Libya, and to enter into side conflicts and civil wars that would fragment its forces and would make it lose its momentum and its compass that seeks to achieve freedom and social justice and decent living. On the other hand, what do we see at the Palestinian level? We see a Palestinian national movement that had been since the middle of the previous century represent the vanguard of the national liberation movements in the Third World. And the popular uprising in 1987 has constituted the peak of this national movement and has presented a model for the popular and mass movements that are peaceful and that have challenged the oppressive regimes in the countries of the Arab Spring. Suddenly, and I say suddenly, metaphorically only, because this suddenly was not really sudden, because there were points of introduction. Suddenly, this national movement lost its momentum, and the Palestinian national movement has lost its role, although it did not have no other alternative, and it accepted to enter in this dark impasse without taking into consideration all the caveats and without insight to provide contingency solutions if there is a need for that. Even after 20 full years. Within the context of the subject of this conference, the fragmentation and division, I'm concerned with the fact that one of the consequences of the Oslo Agreement that has put us into this impasse is the reality of fragmentation and division in the Palestinian entity at more than one level. Oslo Accords, and since its inception, has marginalized the Palestinians of the diaspora and isolated Jerusalem and put it off until the final status, and also abandoned the Palestinians of 1948. And even the issue of the prisoners has been classified into certain specifications that are subject to the blackmail of endless negotiations. The so-called settlement has been divided into an interim period and final status without any guarantees that one would lead to the other. And rather than cooperating with the occupied Palestinian territories or dealing with it as one geographic entity, it has been divided into zones A, B, and C after taking away Jerusalem, which was neither A, B, nor even C. And rather than linking the West Bank with Gaza through a geographic path that would consolidate and express their unity, this demand was abandoned into a safe passage, but there is neither a passage nor any safety until we reach this political division that has enhanced geographic division between the West Bank and Gaza. In addition to fragmenting the final status issues from one case called ending occupation to issues of borders and security and refugees and water and other issues. In addition to fragmentation at the economic level, which will be addressed this morning by Dr. Raja Al-Khaldi. What even aggravates this state of division is perseverance in taking this path of negotiations that is void of any or the simplest form of discipline or lessons on which all the negotiations experiences that have been taken by any liberation movement is based on. Indeed, and honestly I say, whenever I look into the message of the late martyr President Yasser Arafat to Rabin, dated in 1993, 4 days before the signing of the Oslo Agreement, and I read what the assurances and the commitments, I wonder and I ask myself, how could that have happened? How did we accept in one of the items of this letter to commit to Rabin in front of the whole world, not to take any path for salvation and to taking our national interests except negotiations through the so-called peace process, the infamous peace process. This commitment to negotiations as a sole path, which was interpreted by our chief negotiator into saying that life is negotiations. Last but not least, I say vis-a-vis what's with the counter-revolution that we are witnessing from outside the revolution in the Arab landscape, we see ourselves in the Palestinian landscape facing fragmentation and division from within, from inside. The question remains, and the challenge remains, whether it is possible to reassemble what has been disintegrated and how. I apologize for being lengthy in this introduction. And here I would like to give the room for Dr. Raif Zuraiq and Dr. Georgia Kaman. True that each one of them is quite well known. Dr. Raif Zuraiq is a professor in the philosophy of law at the Carmel Center in Haifa and an associate director of the Minerva Center for Literature in the Tel Aviv University. However, I wish to add, honestly, by saying that I find myself, together with many others who would see in Raif Zuraiq's ideas a lot of creativity, which we are in dire need of. He thinks outside the box, and also without any courtesy. And honestly, I would say that Dr. Georgia Kaman, and in addition to being the Director General for Muwatin, which is holding this conference, he is also a member of the faculty in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Beirut State University. And I wish to add sincerely that Georgia Kaman's interventions are not void of challenges to the mainstream that would move the stagnant waters and motivates us for reconsidering many things that have been taken for granted. I would like to start with Dr. Raif. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you to Muwatin for this invitation and for the conference. Thank you, Doctor, who set a trap for me now. So I have to be up to this trap. I fill in. For a while, there has been an increasing feeling that there is a crisis in the Palestinian political action, and I mean by crisis is not, it doesn't mean that are no achievements made in reality. The expression of crisis in political action, Nelson Mandela spent years repeating the same saying in variation of the creative thinking in politics. Sometimes boredom is the master. So sometimes you need to think about this boredom. If you are creative in politics, it may appear as being opportunist. And persistence on a political stance is what a politician should do. But when I call political crisis, I mean uh, it does not mean that there are no achievements, but is to have a persuasion that these achievements are not possible. And this is different of not making achievements, because this transforms politics into another ritual of action, in which case the person acting as politician is not convinced of what he or she is saying. There is an increasing persuasion among Palestinians in Israel that the Palestinian deteriorating situation in Israel is not a result of a policy of a government or another government, but it is a structural inferiority because they have accepted to be a state or half a state. And I believe that there is a kind of persuasion inside the West Bank and Gaza Strip that this is the state. When we were young and we read the Marxist literature, we used to read the Russian popular stories, and part of it, there is a defeated hero who goes on a bungalow which turns on the heels of a chicken, and an old witch tells him sleep because daylight is much more intelligent than the night. So it seems that tomorrow there will be no better solution. This is the state. What we have at hand is what will be tomorrow. In other terms, we will be citizens of half a state. So the Palestinians have to accept to be half a citizen in a state or a citizen in half a state. Half a citizen in a state or half a citizen in a half state. In which case, citizenship and statehood are not existent. And there is an increasing persuasion that all what is possible to achieve will not will not realize the minimum justice. So what is possible is not just, and what is justice as minimum standard is not possible. Still, politicians continue to endeavor, and here I will quote a metaphor of one of my university teachers from another context, and I believe that it is not a bad description of the Palestinian politics, whether it be inside Israel or in the West Bank and Gaza. It is like the priests who has lost their faith, but they continue to work in the temple and repeat the same words. They lost the faith, but they continue the ritual action. I'm talking about this type of crisis. Crisis is to work with a closed horizon and not making achievement. This is the diagnosis of the achievement, because since we have been children, the Palestinian cause has been undergoing a serious curve. So it's all turning around curves in the Palestinian question. But this time, in diagnosing the crisis, there's a kind of bottleneck in the end, and it is not lack of ability or achievement. Since there's this bottleneck, and that the crisis similar, including speaking about return, it may be then beneficial that all of the parties in the crisis come together to discuss this crisis together. So the crisis could be to find or exploit the common denominator that can help understand and exit this crisis. So from this entry point and this psycho-political pressure, I propose to handle preliminary thoughts about the relationship of the part to the whole. The part could be part of the Palestinian people, Palestinian individual, and the whole is the Palestinian people as a single unit. Please allow me in the next 2 minutes to do a kind of separation between two ways of dealing with the dichotomy between the part and the whole. First, there is the knowledge or savvy relation between the part and the whole. In other terms, sometimes the whole is a knowledge condition to understand what the part is. In other terms, it is not possible to speak of the heart or the lungs hadn't we an understanding of the body. You cannot explain to, for instance, what is the don't drive if they do not understand what the computer is. In this term, the whole will be the condition of knowledge that will help us understand the part. And this applies not only in pure sciences, it also applies in biology, but also in political sciences. And there are many perceptions of the relationship between the part and the whole. Some deem the whole necessary to know the part. Modernity is based on reversing this saying, because it sees the whole as the remaining of metaphysical or religious thinking, and we cannot understand the material without understanding the electron. We cannot understand the body without understanding the cell. So this new thinking believes that the whole is nothing but accumulation of parts. However, in the saying, it is how we can discover that this part is part of the whole that constitutes this whole if we do not have an imagination or perception of the whole, so that we cannot exit the perception of the whole. If we want to speak of the different components of the Palestinian whole people, how can we know if we do not have a perception of what the whole is? Are the Bedouins, for example, part of the Palestinian people or not? So the only solution is to deal with the whole, but this is a controversial knowledge issue. But there are other types of relation between the part and the whole, which are normative relations. Is there a precedence of the people over the individual? This could be in the national thinking, yes, the people should precede. The liberal thinking sees that under certain circumstances, it is the individual who should precede. We grant citizens the freedom of consulting a lawyer, although we know that this can help in increasing the rate of crimes, because without a lawyer we could be able to fight crimes better, but sometimes we place certain limits on the will of the nation. You choose what you want, and we lay some constraints on the individual's wish to achieve their goals, but we have also constraints for the defense of in the individual. So there are several sayings and persuasions. Some start from the part or the whole, whether it be in the knowledge relations, in pure sciences, or in political sciences. And there are the strategic relations of the part to the whole. Where do we start? Shall we start with local projects or literacy, adult education in a certain school, or at the global scale of the Palestinian whole? Do we start of reconstructing the PLO, which is a 20-year-old project now, or we start with a clear set project in a certain town and make it spread out as a pilot project to be disseminated. So the question of part and a whole is always questioned, and there is no real answer to it. Palestinian wise, the Palestinian political history began with three units. So the unity of the Arab question was the Arab project, considering that the Palestinian question is the first cause of the Arab people and that the Palestinian people want to become part of the Arabs until 1974 came. And the second unit or unity is the unity of the Palestinian people and Palestinian territory, and the struggle was the armed struggle. Now, these three sayings in our reality today have faded away, and I'm not saying that we were in the paradise and now we're in hell. I don't want to be understood as such at all. There was this uniting with the Arab dimension, and we wanted to take things in hand. And the Palestinian land was fragmented in Oslo, and the negotiations turned into the only way to realize the rights of the Palestinian people. Now, I will speak of these three parameters, but sometimes in the political discourse, there is undermining as if there has been a certain position and some persist on this position in comparison to the positions which have been revoked. For example, persistence to unity with the Arabs and Palestinian unity and negotiations and revoking armed struggle, or supporting armed struggle and forgetting about negotiations, whatever. Now I will go back to this point when I present my perception of the relationship between the part and the whole. However, in the beginning, and as an introduction to what I will be saying later on, I would like to speak a little bit about a milestone, which is Oslo 20 years later, and the problem of the fragmentation of Oslo. Here, I would like to assess the core problem of Oslo. There are many problems in Oslo. They are innumerable. However, a core problem in Oslo, and I am enumerating the problems of Oslo, which will enable me to speak later on of the relationship between the part of the to the whole. But the core issue is not its inability to make achievements on the ground. This is one of the problems, yes, but we also lost a terminology through which we can coordinate our Palestinian narrative and present it in a decent way. It means that in Oslo we lost our language. When we write in Oslo that the Palestinians renounce, not only denounce, but renounce violence, it is as if the problem is not the occupation, but resistance to this occupation. So the struct of Oslo is that there is resistance to the occupation and we need to put an end to this resistance. So when we renounce violence, that is, you get rid of it, terrorism, you named it. You called it terrorism. So if Israel doesn't grant you anything in negotiations because you, linguistically speaking, closed the roles to struggle for what is called now terrorism. You called it, you used the term yourself. So one of the problems of Oslo is a linguistic trap that is the terminological use. And the core problem is the loss of the reference of 1948 as a uniting point of the Palestinian question, as a point to raising questions. The core problem of Oslo, in my opinion, is not in the end goal. I believe that if we have tomorrow a state on the 1967 borders, it will get the support of the majority of the Palestinian people. I did not conduct a referendum on this, but this is my own perception. But the problem is it began in 1967 and evaporated of the 1948. So what starts with 1967 will not end with the 67. And those who come to the fragmentation of Palestine will not go only to the fragmentation of Palestine, but fragmentation of the West Bank as well inside this fragmented Palestine. So the problem is formulating the questions and not the answers, and not of the future vision of the solution, but of the historical formulation of this solution. So when we lose this historical dimension, the Palestinians will not be remembered as having given all of the concessions. They submitted 78% of their homeland, so this 22% is the historical compromise they can give. In other terms, there is fragmentation of history and not necessarily only fragmentation of solutions. The history is being shortened to this level. And I believe that without this 1948 reference, which is the point of unity in the history of the Palestinian people, that is at the time when the Palestinian people and land were a whole unit, without this reference, there is a linguistic crisis, and it's like climbing up the mountain and you lose this road up, so you go down on a flower furnished road, but you cannot find the proper step on which you can land. So the struggle is not to go up the ceiling at all. And I believe not to go up the ceiling, meaning not accepting to divide Palestine. I believe that this will be a two nation state, whether it be two states or one state. This is not the issue. But when you renounce this historical milestone, when you had the unity of people and land, you lost the context. You're out of context. In which case, you lost your ability to express the level of loss. And here, the level of loss must be recorded. If you start in 1967, it's behind your back and say, what are you negotiating for? You're not renouncing, you're not revoking anything. Negotiations is give and take. This is true in the West Bank, this is true for the refugees for inside Israel. There is no talk about equality inside 1948 without recalling the 1948 unity. There is no equality between the defeated and the victorious. There is no meaning of equitability between the people who became refugees and those who ended their refugee statushood. Between people who lost their state and between those who built the modernity, between those who lost their towns and those who gained their towns, between those who fought to establish a state and between those who fought against the state. How can we establish these equalities if we do not bring up front to the speech that we lost our people, our land, and we were a majority, we lost a minority, we had towns, we were like other peoples from Pakistan to Afghanistan to India, building our own modernity, nationalistic and patriotic project, and we lost it. Without using this discourse, all of talks about these qualities will be like walking in moving sands in which you are exhausted. I am a lawyer and I went to courts. You delve into detail, a jungle of details of statistics and figures which are endless. Like Henrik Poincaré, a philosopher, said, I spent my time in laboratories seeking for a meaning of life and theology. And at the end of my life, I understood that I felt that I lost this life under the microscope. Something of this kind. If you lose this moment, you lose the essence because they exhaust you in minor details. And as they are exhausting us in these details, they're exhausting the Palestinian negotiators in these details. So without this reference backstone, The Palestinians immigrate from Palestine and do not return. Without the 1948 reference, there becomes a need to put an end to the Palestinian suffering. This is an important issue to put an end to this displacement, but there's a difference on the discourse that is based on needs and one which is right based. Without the 1948 discourse, the rhetorics about self determination is transformational. That is, it is based on the Zionist model, in which case there is a people who doesn't have a state who must put an end to its displacement and establish a state like any other peoples on the earth, but lose their particular relationship to the land. The Palestinians, the individual homes for the Palestinians, the relationship to their garden, their entrance to the house, and their trees precede the national home. But in the Zionist thinking, there was a thinking of the national home, and after the construction of the national home, individual homes were established. Without the 1948 reference, the rhetorics about self determination is transformed in this meaning, and thus the national home precedes over the individual home, and there is the individual memory which is being evacuated of its meaning. And thus, in this milestone in the Palestinian history, now I don't want to be a missionary, but I will conclude here. I will end my missionary talk. There are balances of powers, and it is clear that there are these balances of powers which act against us. The conspiracy against us is tremendous. The powers which were in this conspiracy are great. But there are two issues that are not subjected to the balances of power, and it is important to be aware of them. One of them is that it is not possible for any uh, executive to force a victim to commit suicide, because this is a logical contradiction to force a victim to commit suicide. The victim can die, be displaced, but commit suicide. This is a privilege of the victim itself, and an executor cannot force a victim to go into this act of suicide. The love and suicide are the only space of freedom of any victim. So if Israel can impose upon us any future solutions and concessions here and there, it cannot, and we should not allow it to be able to change history. So if we decide to make certain concessions in order to find a solution, this is not a justification to renounce our history. There is no contradiction that we say Palestine was an Arab land and we are the original owners of this land, and we still dream of returning to Safa, to Jaffa, and to all of these countries. But for a historical compromise, we accept not to return, although we have this inner will to go. But we are ready for this historical compromise. And here I refer to the relationship of the part of the whole and to the unity to its parts, in which case, if the Palestinians make concessions and they are forced to fragment their future, they should not be forced to fragment their history. And if the solutions come to a point that split Palestine, the Palestinians should not start by dealing on knowledge and on rhetoric based as if Palestine was born to be fragmented. There are some Palestinian issues which I cannot understand or can attribute them to talking about the balances of power. In writing history, I cannot refer such points to the balances of powers. And one of the advantages of Oslo, if it has some, and the fragmentation of the Palestinian situation resulting from Oslo, is that the Palestinians inside Israel, although they're not negotiating with Israel now, and they're not subjected directly to the regional balances of power, they were emancipated of these powers. And therefore, post Oslo, the Palestinian memory, in fact, prospered inside. In other terms, what the Palestinians inside Israel can do, although Israel can impose upon the PLO not only solutions but also history, but inside Israel, since it emancipated of the necessity of reaching a solution with Israel and an agreement with Israel, this emancipation of the necessity of devising a certain compromise for the future with Israel and the certainty among many Palestinians that their future is segregated from the remaining of the Palestinians liberated them to go forward towards their own history. They understood that politically their solution is inside the state of Israel, and they opened up to history after they became aware that you can be Palestinian to the end without being trapped into an open confrontation as the open confrontation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now, I will conclude in the questions and answers. We can talk about this issue, which is the development of the right-based rhetoric in the development of the Palestinian question. And in the discussion, I would like to raise this issue. Let me use the term of risks of going deep into exploiting the right-based rhetoric in our diagnosis. I will try now in the remaining last minutes to be more constructive and justify the trip I took from Nazareth here with more futuristic vision of what we mean by the unity of the Palestinian people and how can we exit this talk about the Palestinian unit as part of the ready-made cliches or the emotional aspect, which is very important for the political work or action, and to grant this saying some political meaningful dimensions which will enable the people live and understand and make their daily living to struggle and go beyond the martyring factions and the kind of clowny movements on the other, as if there are several political projects. I believe that it is important to go beyond two rhetorics. First, the justificationary one, which deals with the people the way they are and not the way they should be. This is the logic of economics and psychology. In psychology, people, you take them the way they are and not in the way they should be. The psychologists who want to start with a super ego will be doomed. They must take you as a reality and deal with you as a fact. And the same applies to the economy. But there's a missionary discourse which differentiates the religious or ethical discourse to deal with the people in the way they should do. And I believe that we need a critical political rhetoric that takes into account where the people are and that they have interests, they have a daily living, but should take their hands to where they should be. In other terms, it should take both dimensions into account. This is very general, that is to go on a critical rhetorics that go beyond acceptance or missionary talks and or preaching. And here I have nothing new to add, but this means that it is necessary that representatives of the Palestinian people sit together and begin to raise on the table the interests of every part and to start from there, where every part of the people exists. Otherwise, it is an over the head talks. It is said and then it is inflicted otherwise. And after taking into account where every part exists, you need to identify the common interests and what a group can offer to the other group. And in the economy, in every point where there are common or different interests, the economists have gone farther than the politicians. These are the free writers are in economists. Prisoner's dilemma, it's a well-known phenomenon. When we have common and different interests, the question is race to the top or race to the bottom. Why does the market exchange go up? Because people think it will be as such and they start buying, and it goes down because everybody thinks that everybody's selling and everybody goes to sell. And there's something that politicians can learn from economists in this context, is to begin where the people are and to find the institutional mechanisms that will enable broadening the so-called the public good and broadening this in their daily life. And this cannot be achieved without confidence-based projects, which will need qualified and trusted individuals. But they cannot go on the long run on only trust-based projects. Institutions for the Palestinian people must be constructed to build this collaborative relation and exchange not only of experiences and capabilities, but also, it's like digging a joint well for the people. This needs long breath and institutional action, and not suicide operations or martyrs or what is, but it needs to accrue with the people. The unity of the Palestinian people under this context is that there's a common enemy, and there are practices like the usurpation of land, which used to exist in Israel, which are now similar to what's taking place in the PNA. The same military apparatus we had until 1966 are the same people. They just shifted it to the other part. So part of the unity resides is that the enemy is common, and without returning always to, at least analytically speaking, if not even strategically, without referring back to this point of 1994 and this milestone in which the Palestinian people was turned into different fragments. Without this, the Palestinian people will lose its compass. In Latin, disaster, which is the calamity, the nightmare, is this star, which means when the person loses the star, the gearing star, it means you lose your way, because the star is what helps you locate your position and you know where you start from and where you're heading to. Those who lose the star lose their context, and those who lose their context lose the meaning of such a context. So let 1948 be our star so that we do not fall in this star. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I have to clarify why we changed the seats. It's because the camera is static, and they wanted the camera to stay as it is, and we should be the moving part, the moving side. So there is a static and moving side. So apparently the camera is the static, and just to clarify this thing. In addition, I would like to indicate before I start. Despite though my topic is a little bit different than the topic of Dr. Raif, but there are common elements. As you have seen, he tackled the two elements: one of integration and splits and division on the one hand, and on the other hand, the elements of unity. To go back to the focus, which is 1948. These are the two elements that will be the main elements in my intervention, though there is some difference. The title of my intervention is The Dangers of Democracy in the Inception Phase. And I have put democracy, the word democracy, between brackets in order to warn that this is a special use of the word that is untraditional, because my topic is Egypt and to a certain extent Palestine, and the disintegration that is taking place in both cases, and though for different reasons. But what is common between both cases is the misunderstanding of democracy that is minimizing it to elections, or to what is said the ballot box, or the opinion of voters as a result of the elections. One would be astonished how common this belief is in Egypt, for instance, among those who are in the government and among the opposition alike, in the Arab and Western media as well. So it is talked about democracy, democratic elections, and the legitimacy of elections, and the political legitimacy as a result of the elections. And in the polemics that is taking place, and the media clamor that is taking place on whether this was a coup d'etat or a revolution after removing the previous president, ex-president Mohamed Morsi. So the core of the difference is latent in the political legitimacy, whether it comes through elections or through what is so-called the revolutionary legitimacy, which is the will of the public or the majority of the public out of the elections. This becomes clear in this polemics, whether this was the coup d'etat or revolution. The opponents of the ex-president Morsi say that this is not a coup d'etat, because the Muslim Brothers accepted that it was a revolution after moving Hosni Mubarak by the Higher Council of the Armed Forces. So what is the difference between the two removals? The supporters of Morsi say that that Mubarak was not elected in a transparent and free way, and this is the main difference between the two cases. And they implicitly accept, the other party accept this implicitly, and says that democracy is not just elections, and the popular will is, at the end of the day, is the source of political legitimacy. And this has been manifested clearly on the 30th of June, and after that, and so on forth. So the discussion continues this way with common ground on this issue. Contradicting to this polemics and this discussion and the open and implicit assumption, the core of my remarks is that the elections are not the basis for political legitimacy at the inception phase of the revolution. So it is not the basis for the political legitimacy at the inception phase, the revolution against the existing regime. On the contrary, because in the case of plurality of programs and parties, it is a divisive element. that would undermine the unity. And the source of political legitimacy at the inception phase is the efforts to achieve the objectives of the revolutions, and elections lead to keeping away of these objectives in most cases. The objectives of the revolution in Egypt and Tunisia are common, though the objectives were formulated as slogans in Tahrir squares: freedom, dignity, and social justice. True that these common or public slogans should be interpreted into political and social programs. It is true that the workers of textile factories in Al Mahalla city, whose big or major strike on the 6th of April 2008 was an indicator to come. And true that their demands are different from the demands of the university graduate, unemployed university graduates, or the middle class demands. But it is not difficult to interpret these slogans into social and political programs, because there are basic needs for the people and for human beings, and these needs are well known: work, health, education, personal safety, and keeping away from indigence as well, and especially in the old age. Now I would like to ask, what do elections do to the revolution objectives around which all parties and movements unified, in addition to the large public? What do elections do with this? What elections do, in fact, is turning this unity into competing parties, competing against each other with different programs, and contradicting and discordant programs, and divide and disintegrate their interests and objectives, and minimizes their interests into party interests, while all of them are claiming or alleging that they will achieve the objectives of the revolution. So alas, what a losing bargain. The elections create or assumes having a stable political regime in which there is a certain degree of agreement among the forces, the main power forces, including this is what reflects normally in the constitution of the state, though in common or general formulas. But these formulas allows to extract laws and policies that stem from the articles of the constitution. But what happened in Egypt was the contrary, totally the contrary. The elections formed the beginning of descending to the precipice of division and internal conflict. This was followed by a constitution that did not have the minimum agreement, and that led to internal division, and that led to the events of the 30th of June. This led to aligning the previous opposition with those who were the defeated supporters of the previous regimes and the deep state. Some people still believe that elections are the basis for the political legitimacy at the beginning of the revolution. And here I recall the saying of a writer who said, if you want to abort a certain revolution, then start with elections. I referred previously that the source of legitimacy in the revolution is in seeking to change the nature of the existing regime, and not just to replace a ruling group by another one, as happened in Egypt. The source of legitimacy is seeking to achieve the objectives of the revolution. True that each revolution has its own specificity, and that you cannot consider any of these revolutions as a model for other revolutions. But if we take, for instance, the Palestinian Revolution, just for example, we would find that the legitimacy of the resistance factions that later gathered under the umbrella of the PLO was based on their efforts to liberate the usurped land, and to remove the Zionist occupation. Hamas followed the same way and built its legitimacy on such a basis before any elections. The resistance, no matter what forms it takes, is the entrance for political legitimacy in the Palestinian state, and especially with the failure of negotiations to realize the aspired Palestinian state, and I will come back to this Palestinian state later. But regarding the elections, elections is just a mere mechanism that aims at the peaceful alternation of power, in addition to representing the voters or to act on their behalf. But starting with elections before realizing any of the objectives of the revolution objectives, as happened in Egypt, and which produced a strong opposition that included the old regime with all its apparatus, with the exception of a number of people who were imprisoned. In addition to those, all those who opposed the Mubarak regime out of after the elections and after Morsi took to power. This led to an objective alliance between the old regime that is still controlling the hinges of the state and the new opposition out of the government that ended into new Tahrir squares, new Tahrir and efforts to undermine the Morsi regime. And this motivated the ex-president Morsi to reconcile with the old regime and refrain from changing and cleansing the various apparatus of the states like security agencies, Ministry of Interior, and so this led to the failure of the regime. It is clear that changing the regime as a whole in Egypt was not possible without unifying all forces and parties and movements that took part in the Tahrir Square and in the revolution. And this was not within the capability of any one party, even if it was the Muslim Brothers. This is what elections led to. It prevented realizing the revolution objectives. So where did this legitimacy of the elections came? Did it come from this failure? This misunderstanding of democracy and and amidst the internal conflict and media clashes gave an aura of sanctity to the ballot box and neglecting the other elements of the democratic regime. If we assumed, for instance, just if elections was considered to be a suitable step to establish a democratic regime after revolution, and it is the declared objective of most parties in Egypt, but neglecting the other elements of this this regime would produce another authoritative regime that is not different from the previous one. So saying that the majority will decide and resorting to the people to decide what they want, and that the ballot box is the judge without any condition. This is very common among various parties and movements in Egypt and is reflected in the media with their various approaches. True that the people should decide or can decide what they want. They can decide, for instance, that they want to restore the old regime, or, for instance, they want to have a royal patrimonial regime without elections, or maybe they want the one-party regime, or they, for instance, they want the army or security forces to control. But the people cannot decide what they want without any conditions and restrictions on their decision if they want. And their leaders want a democratic regime, as it is announced and declared as the declared position in Egypt. Such a regime would put restrictions on the people, and these restrictions are the basis for the political regime, including the rights, civil and political rights and social rights that are granted, and main among them is equal citizenship rights. In addition to that, the main lesson that was deduced for a high price, in fact, during the development of this regime, is related to the nature of the relation between the majority and minority, and mainly the numerical minority. What was it? 45 to 55, whatever. So the numerical minority and added to it other minorities, whether ethnical, national, religious, or sectarial. The main lesson is latent in the fact that neglecting the demands of the minority, no matter what they are, and saying that the majority has the right to rule as they like without taking into consideration the positions and demands of the minority. This negligence leads quite often to an internal big crevice and to a bleeding, internal bleeding and fight unless the necessary lessons are deduced. This is what happened in Egypt around the issue of the constitution. The least that could be said about it is that the majority lacked wisdom and experience and historical knowledge